had been camping for years, usually with friends, but that weekend I decided to go alone. I told myself it was because I needed space, but the truth was I wanted to test myself. I wanted to see if I could handle being completely alone in the woods for a few days without help, without noise, without anyone to rely on. I picked a spot I'd heard about from another hiker, a secluded clearing deep inside a stretch of forest in northern Idaho. Supposedly, it was quiet, peaceful, and far away from any other campsites. That was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning. The drive took hours, most of it through small towns that looked half asleep. The road got rougher the deeper I went, turning from asphalt to gravel, then to a narrow dirt path. I stopped once to fill up on gas and grab a few last-minute supplies: batteries, a pack of jerky, and a small propane canister for my stove. It was already late afternoon by the time I reached the forest's edge. The air changed as soon as I got out of the truck. It was colder, sharper, and smelled like pine and wet dirt. I stood for a minute just listening. There was nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the faraway sound of a woodpecker. The place felt untouched, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every movement you make. I parked the truck off the trail and grabbed my gear. My pack wasn't too heavy, but the hike to the clearing took longer than I expected. The path was narrow and overgrown, twisting between fallen logs and thick brush. Every step crunched through leaves that had started to dry out for the season. I remember thinking how still everything was. No traffic, no people, just endless forest in every direction. When I finally found the clearing, I knew it was the right place. It was a wide, open patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a small ridge rising behind it. There was a faint animal trail running along one side, and a stream not far away. The light from the setting sun came through the trees in thin orange stripes. It looked perfect, like a spot that no one had been to in a long time. I set up camp quickly. Tent first, then my sleeping bag, and finally the fire ring. I gathered dry wood from the edge of the clearing, broke it down into smaller pieces, and got a fire going before it got completely dark. The flames lit up the area with that warm, flickering glow that always makes you feel safe, even when you're deep in the wilderness. After eating, I sat near the fire for a long time, just staring into it. The sound of it popping and hissing filled the quiet. My phone had no signal, which I expected, so I shut it off to save the battery. The stars came out one by one, clearer than I'd seen in years. It felt peaceful, exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, no distractions, just me and the forest. Then, not long after midnight, something changed. I had been half asleep inside my tent when I heard it. A faint rustling sound, just outside. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the small scurry of an animal. It was slower, heavier, like something or someone moving around the campsite, careful not to make much noise. I froze. My first thought was a deer, but the steps were too steady, too deliberate. I stayed still, barely breathing. The sound moved from one side of the tent to the other, then stopped. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, or maybe it was just the wind pushing against the tent's fabric. I reached for my flashlight, switched it on, and aimed it toward the tent wall. The light made the nylon glow pale yellow, but there was nothing visible through it. After a minute or so, the noise faded. I sat up, listening hard. Nothing. No movement, no sound at all. I told myself it must have been an animal and eventually lay back down, though sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw footprints near the fire pit. They weren't mine. They were boot prints, large ones, leading from the tree line toward the tent and then back out again. My stomach dropped when I realized what that meant. Someone had been in my camp during the night. The prints weren't fresh enough to track easily, but they looked recent, pressed deep into the damp soil. I walked around, scanning the trees, listening. The forest was silent again, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was off, like I was being watched. I decided to stay anyway. It was early, and I'd driven too far to turn back after one strange night. I spent the day hiking a bit, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't ignore how quiet it was. No birds, no animals, just that thick, heavy kind of silence that makes you feel like something is hiding just out of sight. When I got back to camp that evening, the fire pit looked different. Some of the ashes were disturbed, as if someone had kicked through them. I knew I hadn't done it. My tools were still where I'd left them, and nothing was missing, but someone, or something, had clearly been there while I was gone. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed by the fire until late, feeding it wood just to keep the light strong. The forest felt alive around me, but not in a good way. I kept imagining eyes out there, watching from behind the trees. Every time the fire crackled or shifted, I flinched. When I finally went into the tent, I left the hatchet beside my sleeping bag. Hours passed. The air got colder. The fire outside burned down to faint orange coals, and I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes again, the tent was filled with pale moonlight. Then I heard it again, the same slow steps, this time closer. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and each step made a faint crunching sound. It came from the left side of the tent, stopped for a second, then started again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped the hatchet and held my breath. The sound circled the tent, paused again near the entrance. I could hear something brushing lightly against the fabric, slow and careful. My heart felt like it was trying to break out of my chest. Then, without warning, something pressed lightly against the side of the tent. Not a full push, just enough to make the fabric stretch inward for a moment. Whoever it was stood there, breathing quietly, and then they were gone. I waited, listening, not daring to move. The woods were silent again, except for my breathing. I stayed awake until morning, gripping the hatchet until my hand went numb. When the sun came up, I checked outside. More footprints, the same size as before. They led straight to the tent and then back into the woods, the same as last time. My small pile of firewood was scattered, and one of my water bottles was gone. I knew then I wasn't alone out there. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. The hairs on my neck stood up the whole time, like something was right behind me. Every little sound in the forest made me turn my head. The feeling of being watched was so strong it almost felt physical. As I loaded the last of my gear into the truck, I looked back toward the trees one final time. For a split second, I thought I saw movement. Someone stepping behind a tree, just barely visible between the trunks. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my nerves playing tricks on me, but I didn't wait to find out. I drove out fast, the tires throwing dirt behind me. I didn't stop until I was well out of the forest, where the trees finally opened up and I could see the open sky again. When I got home, I unpacked my things and checked them over. That's when I realized one of my gloves was missing. I didn't remember dropping it or taking it off anywhere, but it was gone. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I checked the back of my truck. There, on the tailgate, sitting neatly in the corner, was my missing glove. It was damp, as if it had been out overnight, and the fingertips were filled with dirt. That was the last time I ever went camping alone. The woods don't scare me exactly, but I don't trust them anymore. Out there, far from everything, you start to realize how small you are, how easy it would be for someone or something to watch without ever being seen. And when I think back to that night, to the sound of slow, heavy steps circling my tent, I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd unzipped that flap just a few seconds sooner. I went camping one late fall weekend at a small, quiet campground deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It wasn't one of those popular ones filled with families and loud groups. It was an old Forest Service site, barely used anymore, with only a few flat spots cleared out by the river. I'd found it on a map online, a place that didn't even show up on most GPS systems. That kind of isolation was exactly what I was looking for. The drive there took longer than I thought it would. The last 20 miles were nothing but dirt road, rough and narrow, with trees leaning close enough to brush the sides of my truck. The sun was already dropping low when I pulled into the clearing. It was colder than I expected too, low 40s, maybe even high 30s once the sun went down. The air smelled like pine and damp leaves, that sharp, earthy scent that only comes from real woods. I parked near a wide patch of ground not far from the riverbank. You could hear the water moving even from where I stood, steady and low, like a constant whisper under the sound of the wind through the branches. I unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, lantern, and set everything up while there was still some light left. I worked quickly, my hands already getting stiff from the cold. When I was done, I got a fire going. The flames caught easy because I'd brought some dry kindling from home. Watching the firelight flicker against the trees, I started to feel that familiar calm that always comes once camp is set and you're surrounded by nothing but dark forest. The sky was turning deep orange and gray. The temperature dropped fast, and I could see my breath as I sat on the small folding chair near the fire. I cooked a simple meal, just canned chili and some coffee, and watched the steam drift upward in the chill. The world around me was quiet except for the river. It was that kind of quiet where your own heartbeat seems louder than anything else. When it got fully dark, I moved a bit closer to the fire. The flames were the only light for miles. I could see the edge of the trees on the other side of the clearing, black silhouettes against the night. The longer I sat, the more I started to notice small sounds from the forest. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. It was normal stuff, but when you're alone out there, your brain notices every single sound. At one point, I realized the noise had changed. It wasn't random snapping or shifting anymore. It sounded like something steady, like faint, uneven footsteps in the leaves. Not far away either. I froze. I tried to listen carefully, but the fire crackling made it hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I waited for a long time, staring into the trees, but nothing moved. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably just a deer and tried to relax again. The cold was creeping deeper by then, so I decided to call it a night. I added a few more logs to the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag inside the tent, and left the lantern glowing dimly near the entrance. The wind picked up sometime after midnight, brushing against the sides of the tent with a soft flapping sound. I woke to a noise that wasn't the wind. It was faint at first, like someone dragging something heavy over the ground. Came from near the fire pit. I lay still, listening, heart thudding hard against my ribs. Then came another sound, metal lightly scraping on metal. My cooking pot, maybe. Something or someone was definitely outside. I thought about unzipping the tent, but the idea of being face to face with whatever it was made me hesitate. I waited. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again, slower this time. I forced myself to peek through a small gap near the zipper. The fire had burned low, just glowing coals left. But in that dim orange light, I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. Person. They were crouched low, close to my gear, rummaging through it. I could only see part of their body. Dark clothing, a hood pulled up, slow, deliberate movements. They weren't rushing or panicking. They were quiet, calm. My whole body went cold. I tried to move silently, reaching for the small hatchet I kept inside the tent. My fingers shook so much I almost dropped it. When I looked back through the flap, the figure had stood up. I could see their hands now, one of them gloved, the other bare. The bare hand looked stiff, almost swollen, like it didn't move quite right. They bent down and picked up my thermos from beside the fire. Then they turned toward the river and started walking away, slow and uneven, like their leg wasn't working properly. I stayed frozen until I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. Then I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. The cold hit me hard. The firelight showed faint marks in the dirt. Footprints, but dragged and uneven, like the person had limped across the clearing. My thermos was gone, and one of my gloves was missing too. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up by the fire with the hatchet in my lap, waiting for daylight. Every little sound from the woods made my skin crawl. I kept glancing toward the river, half expecting to see movement again, but nothing came back. When the first gray light appeared through the trees, I finally stood and stretched my legs. The forest looked completely still. I packed up fast. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I wanted out of there. Before leaving, I walked toward the river where I'd last seen the figure disappear. The ground there was muddy and wet, and sure enough, there were prints leading right into the brush. They weren't clean shoe prints either. One looked normal enough, but the other was smeared and shallow, almost like the person had been missing part of a foot or couldn't put full weight on it. The prints went a few yards, then turned sharply down toward the riverbank. I followed them carefully, scanning the ground. Near the edge of the water, I saw something shiny sticking out of the mud. My thermos. The lid was off and it was half filled with river water. Beside it was a glove, the one that had gone missing. But this one wasn't mine. It was old, torn at the fingertips, the inside stiff with something dark, like dried mud or maybe old blood. I stood there, staring down at it, the sound of the river rushing quietly beside me. There was a faint indentation in the mud leading right into the water, as if someone had slid or crawled down the bank. I looked around, but there were no other signs. No fresh footprints, no ripples, nothing moving across the water. I picked up my thermos, left the glove where it was, and backed away slowly. My hands were shaking again. I didn't want to imagine what had really happened there, whether that person had gone into the water by accident or on purpose, or if they were still somewhere nearby watching. I hiked back to my truck without stopping once. The air was biting cold, and the forest felt heavier with every step, like it was pressing in on me. When I reached the road, I could see my breath coming fast, pale clouds in the air. Driving out, I kept thinking about that limp, that strange dragging walk, about how calm the person had seemed, like they'd done this before, about the glove, the mud, and the silence that came after. When I finally made it home later that evening, I unpacked everything in the garage. My gear smelled like smoke and wet earth. I checked my tent for tears, cleaned the stove, and wiped down the hatchet. When I got to my backpack, I noticed something stuck under one of the straps. A single fingertip from a glove, torn off, packed with dirt. That was the last time I ever camped alone. Even now, years later, I think about that night when I hear the sound of a river in the dark. I think about the way those footsteps dragged across the ground, slow and steady, like whoever that was didn't feel pain anymore. Sometimes, when I tell the story around a campfire, people laugh nervously or say it sounds made up. But I remember the cold air, the limp, the quiet way they moved, and the prints that led straight into the river. I remember how real it was, how close they came to my tent, and that's not something you forget. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed to get away from everything for a while. Work had been stressful, and I felt drained in a way that sitting at home couldn't fix. The plan was simple. Drive out to a quiet forest site I'd used once before, stay for 2 nights, hike a bit, cook over a fire, and clear my head. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going because I didn't think it mattered. I just wanted silence. It was late October, and the air had that dry, cool sharpness that comes before winter really sets in. The sky was clear when I left, pale blue with streaks of thin white clouds, and the trees were half bare, their leaves scattered across the ground like pieces of gold and rust. I packed my small tent, sleeping bag, stove, and enough food to last a couple of days. I liked going light, less to worry about, less to haul. The drive took nearly 3 hours, most of it on back roads that got narrower and rougher the deeper I went. By the time I reached the dirt path that led to the campsite, my truck was coated in dust, and the radio had gone to static miles back. The forest swallowed everything. It was quiet except for the crunch of my tires and the distant echo of wind moving through the trees. I reached the spot just before sunset. It was an open patch surrounded by tall pines, with a slope down to a shallow stream about 100 yards away. I remembered it clearly from the last time I'd been there. It always felt peaceful, private, safe. I parked the truck just off the path, killed the engine, and let the silence settle around me. There's a certain kind of quiet you only get that deep in the woods. It's not total silence. It's layers of faint, distant sounds, the hiss of leaves shifting, the low creak of tree trunks in the wind, maybe a bird calling far away, but nothing human. I breathed it in like it was something rare. I set up camp quickly while the light faded. Tent first, then the fire ring. I gathered a few fallen branches, broke them into manageable pieces, and got a fire going with a lighter and some dry twigs. Once it caught, the orange glow spread, flickering across the bark of the trees around me. I heated some canned soup on the small stove, ate quietly, and sat staring at the fire for a long time. When the sky went dark, it went completely black. There were no houses for miles, no lights except the fire and the stars. The air grew colder, and I wrapped myself in my jacket, stretching my hands toward the warmth. My breath came out in small white clouds. That's when I noticed how the forest had gone still. Before, there had been those background noises, the faint scurry of something small in the leaves, the occasional creak of branches, but now there was nothing. The air had that heavy, listening kind of silence that presses on your ears. I tried to ignore it. Silence out here wasn't unusual. Animals sleep, the wind shifts. It's part of the rhythm of the woods. I told myself that as I sat watching the fire. Still, my skin prickled like something unseen was nearby, just outside the edge of the light. After a while, I crawled into my tent. The fabric walls glowed faintly from the firelight outside. I zipped the door shut, slipped into the sleeping bag, and lay still, listening. My heartbeat sounded loud in my ears. For a while, I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Then came a sound that snapped me fully awake. It was faint at first, something brushing against the outside of the tent. A slow, dragging sound like fingers or maybe a stick tracing along the nylon. It moved from one side to the other, deliberate, steady. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. The sound paused for a moment, then continued, circling halfway around before stopping completely. I waited. I could hear the fire outside, still faintly crackling. Nothing moved. After a few minutes, I slowly unzipped the sleeping bag and reached for my flashlight. The small click as I turned it on sounded deafening in the quiet. I pointed the beam toward the tent wall but saw nothing. I unzipped the tent flap just an inch and looked out. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Beyond that, only darkness. The trees stood like black walls around the clearing. There was no sign of movement. I stepped out slowly, the cold air biting my face. I turned the flashlight in a slow circle, scanning the ground, the trees, the stream area beyond. Then I saw it. Footprints. Not boots or shoes, bare feet. They started just beyond where the light from the fire reached, in the soft dirt, and led toward the back of my tent. I followed them with my eyes. They were uneven, slightly staggered, like the person, or whatever it was, had been limping. The prints went around the tent, paused near the entrance, and then led back toward the woods. I felt that deep, twisting kind of fear that sits in your stomach. Someone had walked around my camp while I was asleep. Someone barefoot, in near-freezing weather, miles from anything. I backed toward the fire pit, grabbed a log, and stirred the coals back into a small flame, just to have more light. The footprints looked fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by wind or moisture. Whoever had made them had been there very recently, maybe minutes before I woke up. I didn't go back into the tent after that. I sat by the fire with the flashlight on my lap and the hatchet I kept for splitting wood resting beside me. The forest stayed quiet. The cold crept deeper into my bones, but I didn't care. I kept my eyes on the tree line until the first pale light of dawn finally came. When morning fully arrived, everything looked ordinary again. The woods didn't feel threatening anymore, just still and damp. I stood and stretched, my muscles stiff from sitting so long. Then I walked around to check the area in daylight. The footprints were still there, clearer now. I followed them a little ways into the trees. They went maybe 20 feet, then just stopped at a patch of dead leaves. No sign of where the person had gone next. No trail, no branches bent, nothing disturbed. It was as if whoever it was had simply vanished. I packed up fast. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't even pour coffee. I just broke down the tent, loaded the truck, and got out of there. My hands were shaking when I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't feel safe until I was miles down the road, where the trees finally thinned and I started to see small signs of civilization again. When I got home later that evening, I unloaded my gear in the garage. As I shook out the tent to dry it, a small thing fell from the folded fabric onto the floor. It was a short, thin twig, except it wasn't shaped like any normal stick. It was bent slightly, smooth at the end, with the texture of something that had once been alive. When I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a twig at all. It was a small piece of bone, about the length of my finger, worn and pale. I dropped it immediately. I don't know how it got there, whether it had been under the tent or stuck to the fabric somehow, but it looked old, weathered but not ancient. I stood there staring at it on the concrete floor, feeling that same cold dread I'd felt in the woods. I thought about those bare footprints, the limp in their pattern, the silence that had filled the forest right before I woke up. I wrapped the piece of bone in a rag, threw it deep into the garbage can outside, and locked the lid. That night, when I tried to sleep, I kept seeing those prints circling the tent in my head. I kept thinking about the person who'd made them, barefoot in the freezing dark, close enough to touch the fabric of the tent while I was inside. I haven't gone camping alone since. The woods don't feel the same to me anymore. I still love them, but now when I walk among the trees, I notice things I didn't before. The silence, the faint marks in the dirt, the way shadows sometimes seem to bend around you when the light fades. And every now and then, when I hear the soft crunch of footsteps behind me on a trail, I stop and look down, just to make sure there are more than one set of prints. It was early autumn when I decided to go camping alone again. The air had just started to cool down, the bugs were mostly gone, and the woods were quieter than they'd been all summer. I picked a place near an old state park I'd been to before, far enough from the main campgrounds that I wouldn't have to hear people talking or car doors slamming all night. I wanted to feel alone out there, cut off from the constant noise of everything. The road that led to the trailhead was rough and full of potholes. I drove slow, letting my tires roll over the stones while dust lifted behind me. I had my gear packed neatly in the back of the truck. A tent, small gas stove, sleeping bag, and a backpack with all the basics. I wasn't planning on staying more than 2 nights. I just needed a reset. When I finally parked at the dead end of the trail, I saw only one other vehicle. A small gray sedan covered in dirt. Its rear window had duct tape running across it like someone had patched a crack. There was a wheelchair folded and strapped to the roof rack with bungee cords. I didn't think much of it at the time. People with disabilities camp too, and maybe someone was meeting friends down the trail. I loaded my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking in. The path was narrow, covered in pine needles, and wound through thick clusters of trees. The smell of damp earth and resin filled the air. Every now and then I'd see flashes of sunlight through the branches. It was peaceful in that quiet, heavy way that deep woods can be. After about an hour, I reached a flat stretch near a small lake. The water was calm and reflected the trees perfectly. There was an old fire ring there, some leftover blackened stones from someone's last visit, and enough flat space for a tent. I decided that was home for the night. I set up my tent carefully, making sure the ground was even. I boiled water for coffee, sat on a fallen log, and watched the surface of the lake shimmer. The forest felt empty, and that emptiness was comforting. I didn't hear any cars, no planes, not even voices from far-off trails, just the sound of wind moving softly through the trees. As I was finishing my coffee, I noticed something moving near the opposite side of the lake. It took me a second to make sense of what I was seeing. A man was making his way along the shoreline, slowly, awkwardly, using crutches. His steps were uneven, and he had a backpack that looked far too heavy for him. I realized it must have been the person from the gray sedan. He was dressed plainly, wearing a flannel shirt and old jeans. He didn't seem to notice me watching. He stopped every few steps, adjusting his footing carefully before taking another. His movements were deliberate, like he'd practiced them. It looked exhausting. I stayed where I was, just observing quietly. He reached a spot not far from the lake's edge and started setting up his own small tent. It looked old, patched in places, but he managed. Every motion was careful and slow. I could tell his legs didn't work the way they should, but there was a determination to how he did everything. It struck me how much effort it must take for him to come out here alone. The sun dropped lower, and the lake went dark. I built my fire and cooked a simple meal, then just sat listening to the crackle of wood. Across the water, I could barely make out the faint glow of the man's campfire. It flickered weakly between the trees. That night, I lay in my tent, half awake. The forest had that deep silence that makes every sound sharper. At one point, I thought I heard something metallic clatter faintly, like a crutch hitting a rock. Then, faint scraping in the leaves. I figured the man might have been moving around his camp, maybe checking his fire or organizing gear. I didn't think much of it and fell asleep again. The next morning, mist hung low over the lake. I stepped out of the tent and stretched. It was colder than the day before. My breath came out in pale clouds. I looked across the water to where I'd seen the other camp. The fire was out. The tent flap hung open. I couldn't see anyone moving around. I decided to take a walk around the lake. The ground was soft with dew, and the air smelled fresh. When I reached the other side, I saw the man's campsite more clearly. His tent was still there, but the inside was empty. A sleeping bag lay half unzipped, and some of his things were scattered around. An old tin mug, a folded jacket, a half-eaten pack of crackers. It didn't look like he'd packed up. I stood there for a long time, feeling uneasy. His crutches were gone. The ground near the tent showed tracks, dragged footprints, uneven, leading into the woods. They weren't clean prints like you'd see from someone walking firmly. They looked more like someone had stumbled repeatedly, catching their balance over and over. The tracks went toward a slope covered in ferns and brush. I followed them a little ways, calling out once, but there was no answer. The forest swallowed every sound. The further I went, the more tangled the ground became, until I lost sight of the tracks in the undergrowth. I turned back. I didn't like how quiet it felt, how wrong the scene looked. I figured maybe he'd gone off to find something or relieve himself, but I couldn't shake a strange feeling. His camp didn't look like someone who'd left temporarily. It looked abandoned mid-action. I spent the rest of the morning restless. Every so often I'd glance across the lake, expecting to see him return, but his camp stayed still and silent. That night, the wind picked up. The trees creaked and swayed. I tried to sleep but kept waking to the sound of something faint, something that didn't sound like wind or animals. It was a distant, rhythmic dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through wet leaves. Came and went, barely audible over the gusts. I kept telling myself it was a branch moving or a fallen log shifting, but it went on for too long. When I finally did sleep, I woke again near dawn to find everything covered in a thin layer of mist. The air smelled sharp and cold. I packed up early, anxious to leave. I glanced again across the lake. The tent was still there, unmoved. I hesitated before leaving. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I walked around once more, following the same path as before. The camp was untouched since the last time I'd seen it. The same scattered items, same empty tent. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. A crutch lying half buried in the brush about 20 yards behind the tent. The metal frame was bent, like it had been twisted under weight. The ground near it was scuffed, and the marks led down toward the slope again. I followed them just a short distance before they disappeared into thick mud. I stood there staring, the early light filtering through the trees, my breath visible in the cold air. Everything was quiet except for the slow dripping of water from the leaves. There was no sign of the man anywhere. I thought about trying to find a ranger, but I was a good few miles from the main park entrance, and there was no cell signal. I decided to mark the location in my GPS and report it when I got back to town. When I finally reached my truck later that morning, the gray sedan was still there. The windshield was fogged on the inside, and there were faint hand smudges on the driver's side window. It looked like no one had touched it since I'd arrived. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it, feeling that same strange heaviness settle in my stomach. I drove out slow, watching the mirror until the car disappeared behind the trees. That night, when I got home, I called the local ranger station and told them what I'd seen. The car, the man with crutches, the empty camp, and where it was. The ranger thanked me and said they'd send someone to check. He didn't sound surprised. A few days later, I called back to ask if they'd found anything. The person on the line said they'd located the campsite, but no one was there. The car had been towed. They told me not to worry, that sometimes campers wander off and leave things behind. But there was a tone in their voice that said they didn't really believe that. Weeks passed, and I tried not to think about it. But every so often, it would come back. The image of that camp across the lake, the bent crutch, the dragging sound in the dark. I wondered how long that man had been out there alone, struggling to move through the woods, pushing himself where most people wouldn't dare go. Maybe he'd come for the same reason I had, to find quiet, to escape. But something about the way his tracks ended, the way that Crutch was left behind, makes me think he didn't leave by choice. Even now, whenever I camp near water and see a bit of mist floating on the surface, I find myself looking across to the other side, half expecting to see a small, flickering fire and the shadow of a man standing on crutches, steadying himself against the wind. But I never do, and that's somehow worse. I went camping that weekend with a small group of coworkers, including a guy named Mark. Everyone at work knew him. He'd lost 2 fingers on his right hand years ago in some kind of factory accident, and he made jokes about it constantly. It wasn't in a dark or depressing way either. He used humor to make everyone else feel comfortable around him. His favorite line was that he couldn't wave properly anymore without people thinking he was flipping them off. He used that joke almost every day, especially on new employees. Mark was the type of person who loved to prank people. He'd hide behind shelves, drop a wrench to make someone jump, pretend to lose balance near heavy equipment. Stuff that got laughs once you realized it was a joke. But he was also serious about safety. He always reminded everyone to double-check machines, wear gloves, stay focused. He'd tell new hires, "Don't end up like me." Even when he was joking, you could tell he meant it. He'd seen what could happen if you weren't careful. So when he suggested a camping trip for a few of us after a long week, everyone agreed. It was early autumn, cool at night but still warm during the day, and we all wanted a break from the noise and metal and long shifts. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, just a weekend out by the woods, fishing, grilling, sitting around a fire. We drove out to a spot about an hour outside town, near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. It was remote, surrounded by dense pine forest and long stretches of uneven ground. There was a wide clearing near a shallow creek where we set up camp. The air smelled like pine sap and wet leaves. The ground was soft with moss, and the sound of running water carried faintly through the trees. It felt good to be out there. No machines, no noise, just the woods. We got the tents up, gathered firewood, and spent most of the afternoon setting up and drinking beer while Mark told stories about accidents that had happened at work. He told them like comedy routines, always ending them with a laugh and then a serious note about being careful. I remember thinking how he could turn something awful into something people actually laughed at. That was just who he was. As the sun went down, we started the fire. The light flickered across the trees and made the forest seem alive. We cooked hot dogs on sticks, drank more, and watched the fire twist and spark. The night air grew cold fast, and by the time it was fully dark, the only light came from the flames and the soft glow of a flashlight hanging from a nearby branch. The forest beyond the clearing was pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't tell how close the trees are or where the ground dips. Every few minutes you'd hear something small moving through the leaves, probably a raccoon or squirrel, but in the dark, it always sounded bigger. Mark was sitting closest to the fire. He was in one of those fold-up camping chairs, leaning forward, his half-gloved hand resting on his knee. I noticed that he didn't wear gloves much anymore, not even to cover what was missing. The hand looked healed but rough, like old scars that had been burned and smoothed over time. 2 fingers gone, the middle and ring finger, leaving a jagged space between the others. He didn't hide it, though. He was the loudest that night, laughing hard and making jokes. Every so often, he'd flick something small into the fire, a leaf, a stick, and say something about it burning faster than a rookie's patience. Around midnight, everyone started getting tired. The temperature dropped more, and our breath came out in small white clouds. One by one, people went off to their tents. Mark stayed up a bit longer, still sitting by the fire. He said he was going to finish one last beer and then head to bed. I went into my tent but didn't fall asleep right away. I could still hear the fire crackling and the faint sound of Mark moving around outside. I figured he was cleaning up or getting his things ready for the night. Then it went quiet. When I woke up, it was still dark, but I could tell something was off. The fire was out, and the air felt colder than before. I thought maybe it was early morning, the coldest part of the night. I lay there for a bit, listening. Everything was silent. No wind, no bugs, no movement. Then I heard something faint. A scraping sound like metal on rock. Came from somewhere near the fire pit. I stayed still, listening. Stopped, then started again, slower this time. I unzipped my tent halfway and looked out. The fire was a pile of faintly glowing ashes, barely visible. I could make out the outline of Mark's chair still sitting there, but I didn't see anyone. The scraping sound came again, closer now, followed by a sharp clink, like a can being kicked over. I thought maybe Mark had gotten up to use the woods, maybe tripped over something. But then the noise stopped completely. The silence afterward was heavy, like the air was holding its breath. When morning finally came, the sunlight felt almost strange, too bright after how dark the night had been. Everyone started coming out of their tents, yawning and stretching. But Mark wasn't up. His chair was still by the fire, but he wasn't there. We figured he'd gone to the creek early or maybe walked down the trail. I noticed his gloves and jacket were still there. So was his flashlight. After about half an hour, we started calling his name. No answer. We checked the creek. Nothing. His footprints led down toward the water but didn't come back. The mud there was soft and slick, and it looked like he might have slipped. The tracks stopped at the edge of the creek, and that was it. No splash marks, no sign of him crossing. Nothing. Just stopped. We spent hours looking, calling out, checking both sides of the stream and the nearby woods. Nothing. No clothes, no gear, not even a broken branch to show where he'd gone. Eventually, one of us hiked back to where the trucks were parked to get cell service and call for help. A search team came later that day. They combed the area for 2 days. They found pieces of trash from our camp, some beer cans, and one of Mark's boots half buried near the creek bed. But that was it. The theory was that he'd fallen into the creek and been carried downstream, though it was shallow and slow moving. Maybe he hit his head. Maybe he wandered off in the dark, disoriented. There were too many possibilities and no solid answers. When I got home, I kept thinking about that sound I'd heard in the night, the slow scraping, the clinking metal. I tried to convince myself it was just him moving something, maybe stoking the fire or picking up his chair, but something about it didn't feel right. A few weeks later, I went to pick up some of his things from the shop. His locker was still there, untouched. Inside was his old work glove, the one he wore before losing his fingers. The tips of the middle and ring fingers were sliced open, dark with grease and old stains. Someone had written on the inside of it in permanent marker, "Always be careful." I stood there for a long time, staring at it. He used to say that all the time, usually as a joke, sometimes seriously. I used to laugh when he said it like everyone else did. But standing there, looking at that glove, I realized how much he must have meant it. After that camping trip, I stopped taking safety for granted. I stopped brushing off those little things people warn you about, because sometimes it isn't the big, obvious danger that gets you. Sometimes it's the small moment when you stop paying attention, the quiet second when you think you're safe, when you think nothing bad can happen. That trip taught me that lesson the hard way. We never found Mark. His things were still there by the fire, his prints still clear in the mud by the creek. But he was gone. No one saw him again after that night. And every time I go near the woods now, even just driving by a line of trees, I think about that sound I heard in the dark. The slow scrape of metal against rock, steady and deliberate, like someone moving just a few feet away. I'll never know what it was for sure, but I know that after it stopped, so did Mark. I worked as a camp counselor for 3 summers at a lakefront camp up north. It wasn't a big place, just a handful of old wooden cabins, a dining hall that always smelled like wet socks and cereal milk, and a long stretch of pines that sloped down toward the water. The job itself was simple. Watch the kids, run the activities, make sure no one drowned or broke a leg, and at night, when the air got cold and quiet, gather them around the fire to tell scary stories. That last part was my favorite. I became known as the counselor with the best ghost story. Every summer, there'd be new kids, and the same story would make its rounds again. The story was about a ghost who would come after you unless you gave him 2 of your teeth and told him 2 names of people to take instead. It wasn't a very original story, But kids didn't know that. They'd huddle close to the fire, knees drawn to their chests, eyes wide as the firelight flickered across their faces. The way the flames would twist and pop at just the right moments made it easy to build tension. I always saved the best part for last. See, I was missing 2 of my teeth. When I was a kid, my adult ones never grew in. The dentist gave me a retainer with fake ones to fill the gaps. You couldn't really tell unless I took it out. It became my little trick for the story. Right when I'd get to the part about the ghost coming for his payment, I'd pretend to hesitate, lean in close to the group, and then slip my retainer out without anyone noticing. When I grinned wide, showing the 2 missing teeth, the kids would jump back or cover their faces. Every time it worked perfectly. They'd all scream or laugh, sometimes even cry. It was mean, but it became my trademark. That last summer, though, things went differently. We had a new group of kids, mostly around 10 or 11 years old, and a few new counselors. The camp director was older now and didn't keep as close an eye on us at night. We had more freedom, which made things more relaxed but also a little careless. The nights were longer than usual, hot and still, and I'd started taking longer walks after lights out, just to clear my head. You could hear the lake even from the top of the hill. The water would lap against the shore in slow, uneven slaps. The air always smelled like pine needles and burnt charcoal from the fire pit. One night, after a long day of swimming and hiking, the kids were restless. They'd been bickering all afternoon, so I decided to calm them down with the story. The fire crackled low, and the woods behind us were almost pitch black. You couldn't see more than a few steps past the circle of light. I started slow, just like I always did, talking about a ghost who wandered the woods, taking teeth as payment. The same build-up as always. I watched their faces and felt that same small rush when they started to lean closer. When I got to the part about giving up 2 teeth to survive, I went through the usual motions. I paused, lowered my head, and then looked back up at them. The moment felt perfect, silent, tense. Even the fire burned quieter. I slipped the retainer out with my tongue, grinned wide, and let them see the gaps. A few of them gasped and jumped, some laughed nervously. It landed perfectly. The whole group screamed when one of them dropped his marshmallow stick into the fire, sending sparks up into the air. When I sent them to bed, I still felt that buzz of satisfaction. I went back to the fire, poured water on it, and sat for a while, just letting the embers hiss and smoke. The woods always felt different after midnight. It wasn't like during the day when you could hear the birds and the wind in the branches. At night, it was heavier, like the dark itself pressed against your skin. Every noise sounded closer. I started to feel that slight unease that always comes when you're alone in the woods. It's not fear at first, it's more like awareness. You notice the way your own breathing sounds too loud, the way your footsteps crunch unevenly. I stood up, picked up my flashlight, and started heading toward my cabin. I was halfway there when I realized I didn't have my retainer in. I patted my pockets, but it wasn't there. I must have dropped it when I scared the kids. I went back to the fire pit, shining my light around the dirt. The beam bounced across the rocks and logs, catching the silver glint of old soda cans and half-burnt sticks, but not the retainer. I crouched down, brushing my hands through the dirt and pine needles. Still nothing. I stayed there for maybe 10 minutes before giving up. When I got back to the counselor's cabin, the others were already asleep. I lay down on my bunk, but I couldn't stop thinking about the missing retainer. It wasn't expensive, but it was noticeable when I didn't wear it. I planned to look again in the morning. I woke up early, before sunrise. The woods were foggy, and the grass was wet. I went back to the fire pit with a stick to sift through the ashes. I figured maybe it had fallen into the fire and melted. I dug through everything: wet charcoal, bits of food wrappers, the half-burned log from the night before. Nothing. Later that day, one of the kids, a quiet boy named Ryan, said something about hearing noises behind the cabins last night. I brushed it off. Animals always moved through at night: raccoons, deer, sometimes even foxes. But when I walked the trail behind the cabins, I noticed footprints. Not big ones, but still fresh. The soil was damp enough that you could see where someone had stepped, right at the tree line. They weren't shoe prints though, they looked like bare feet. small like a kid's. That night, I didn't tell a story. The kids went to bed early, and I sat by the fire again, this time without much interest. Around midnight, I thought I heard something move in the brush near the lake. It was a slow sound, almost dragging. I stood up, trying to listen. The air was still, but the noise came again, faint but real. I turned my flashlight toward it, but the beam only reached a few yards into the trees. I saw nothing but wet branches and fog. I told myself it was just my imagination. It had been a long day, and I was probably overtired. I went back to my cabin and lay down. I kept waking up through the night, hearing little sounds, like sticks snapping, faint scraping on wood. Every time I sat up, the sound stopped. By morning, I felt uneasy. When I stepped outside, the fire pit had been disturbed. The ashes were scattered, and one of the benches had been tipped over. I thought maybe one of the kids had sneaked out, but they all swore they hadn't. I noticed something in the dirt next to the pit. It was my retainer. It was half buried in the ashes, blackened but still there. I picked it up and wiped it off with my shirt. It looked fine, just a little dirty. That night, I didn't tell any more stories. Something about that find unsettled me. Maybe it was the idea that someone or something had moved it during the night. I put it back in my pocket and tried to ignore the feeling that someone had been there when I wasn't. I finished the summer and went home like usual, but that last week stayed with me. I couldn't shake the thought of those small footprints behind the cabins or the retainer showing up after I'd searched the whole fire pit. Maybe a kid was playing a prank, maybe I just missed it the first time, but it never really sat right with me. Even now, years later, when I think back on that last summer, I remember that night by the fire and the way the woods went quiet all at once. I can still picture the dirt around the fire pit and how cleanly the retainer was placed back in the ashes, like it had been set there, not dropped. I still have that retainer tucked in a box somewhere. I don't wear it anymore, of course, but I can't bring myself to throw it away. Every time I come across it, I get that same feeling in my stomach, that something about those nights never quite added up. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe I just needed a good scare after all the times I'd given them. But whenever I see it, those two missing teeth look more like something taken than something lost. I used to work as a summer camp counselor up north, deep in the woods where the nights were always damp and the air smelled like pine and smoke. Every counselor had their own way of entertaining the kids around the campfire. Some told ghost stories, some did skits, some just roasted marshmallows and called it a night. But for me, the stories were everything. I wanted the kids to go back to their cabins thinking about what they heard, maybe too scared to fall asleep. That was the fun part, getting them to believe even just for a little while. Over the years, I'd built up a collection of stories, most of them made up from bits and pieces I'd heard from other camps. But the best one I ever told came about because of a little accident that happened a few weeks before the summer started. I'd been cleaning out my garage, trying to move some old metal folding chairs, when one slipped and came down hard on my hand. It crushed one of my fingers bad enough that I lost the nail completely. The nail never grew back right, and for a while it looked terrible, half scar, half bone. Eventually, it smoothed out, but that finger never looked normal again. It was slightly crooked, pale, and the tip was hard and discolored. It became kind of a weird trademark. I didn't like it at first, but the kids always noticed it when I handed out esmores or lit the fire. I started to make a story around it, something that made use of the way it looked. That was when the idea hit me. What if I turned that finger into the focus of my story? I built the whole tale around it, told in a slow, serious voice, with the firelight flickering across my hand as I held it out. That summer, we had a big group, 16 kids in my section, all between 10 and 12 years old. They were loud, curious, always trying to one-up each other. When the sun went down and the forest started to cool, I gathered them around the fire pit. The smell of burning would mix with the sweetness of roasted marshmallows. You could hear insects buzzing in the background and the occasional owl hooting far off. The lake beyond the trees reflected little streaks of moonlight through the branches. I started the story slow, keeping my voice low, using the pauses and the crackle of the fire to build tension. I told them about a lumber mill worker from years ago who had gotten careless with his equipment and lost one of his fingers in the machine. They leaned closer as I described how he'd searched for the missing piece of himself in the sawdust, but never found it. I let the story grow darker as I talked about how the man returned to work too soon and how the same machine caught him again, this time crushing more than just his hand. While I told it, I used my own hand to illustrate it. The finger that looked wrong glowed faintly orange from the firelight, and I made sure to gesture slowly, letting the kids notice it on their own. By the time I got to the part where the worker was said to have buried his hand somewhere in the woods near the camp, they were all completely focused. I ended it by saying that sometimes, when you walk too far into the woods alone, you might see a finger poking out from the dirt, still reaching for what it lost. It was perfect. The reaction was exactly what I wanted. A few of them laughed nervously, some covered their faces, and one of them just stared wide-eyed at my hand like he couldn't believe it was real. I didn't say anything else. I just smiled and started putting out the fire, letting them think about what they'd heard. After everyone went to bed, I sat alone for a while. The forest was quiet, and the embers from the fire glowed red against the ash. I kept staring at my finger. It looked different in the light, darker somehow, almost black near the nail. I figured it was just the soot from the fire, but when I rubbed it, nothing came off. It didn't hurt, but there was a strange tingling that I hadn't noticed before, a sort of dull warmth spreading through the tip. I shook my hand, thinking it was just the heat. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up, feeling like something was crawling under my skin. It wasn't painful, just irritating, like a pulse that wouldn't settle. I got up and went to the bathroom by the dining hall, where the light stayed on all night. I looked at my finger in the mirror. It looked swollen, faintly red along the side, but not infected. I ran cold water over it until it went numb. By morning, it looked normal again. I brushed it off, but the memory stuck with me. A few nights later, I told the story again to a different group of kids. The same reaction, the same fear in their eyes. But this time, something felt off while I was telling it. My finger started to throb midway through, the kind of deep ache that comes with an old injury flaring up. It distracted me, but I pushed through and finished the story. When I looked down at my hand afterward, the skin around that finger looked pale, almost white, and the nail had darkened again. I kept rubbing it, trying to get the color back, but it stayed that way. I didn't tell anyone. I figured it was probably just bad circulation, or maybe I'd held my hand too close to the fire. Still, I stopped using it for much. When I lit fires or cooked, I used my other hand. Toward the end of the summer, we had our final campout. One big night by the lake, all the cabins gathered together. The fire was huge that night, sparks flying high into the air. I decided to tell my story one last time. I figured it'd be my send-off, something to leave behind for the next group of counselors to talk about. When I got to the part about the finger reaching out from the dirt, I held my hand up again. The kids gasped. The firelight caught the strange color of my skin perfectly. It looked almost lifeless, gray and stiff. I hadn't realized how bad it looked until I saw their faces. It didn't even feel like mine anymore. I lowered it slowly, finishing the story as planned. But afterward, I couldn't stop staring at it. That night, when everyone went to bed, I sat by the dying fire again. The woods were silent, the air heavy. I turned my hand over in the dim light. The finger was colder than the rest, the skin around it slightly shriveled. I pressed it with my thumb. It didn't feel like much of anything, just numb. I decided I'd see a doctor after the summer. Maybe it was just poor circulation or nerve damage. But a part of me wondered if it had always been worse than I'd thought, if the accident had done more harm than I realized. After camp ended, I went home and forgot about the story for a while. I didn't tell it again, but every now and then, when I'm outside at night, lighting a small fire in the backyard, I find myself glancing down at that same finger. The nail never really grew back the way it should have, and the skin still looks faintly gray under certain light. It doesn't hurt anymore, but it's always colder than the rest. The funny thing is, the story stuck. A few years later, I ran into an old counselor who'd still been working at that camp. He told me they still tell the finger story to this day. They even call the spot where I used to sit the workers' pit. He laughed when he told me, said it freaks out the new kids every year. I just smiled and nodded. It's strange, though, because every time I light a fire now, no matter where I am, I feel that same warmth start to rise in that one finger again, like it's remembering something it shouldn't. Maybe it's just nerves or an old injury acting up. Or maybe some things just stay with you after you make them part of your story. Either way, I don't tell that one anymore. Some stories stop belonging to you once you've told them enough times. They take on their own kind of life. And sometimes, if you're not careful, they leave something behind in return. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip through the Irish countryside. I'd rented a small car in Dublin, planning to drive west and find a quiet spot to camp for a night or two. I'd packed light, tent, sleeping bag, stove, a bit of food, and set off that morning with the kind of excitement you only get from being completely alone on unfamiliar roads. The forecast had called for light rain, but nothing that sounded too worrying. I'd driven in worse. By mid-afternoon, though, the weather had changed. The clouds came in thick and low, and the first drops of rain started hitting the windshield like bits of gravel. At first it was just a drizzle, then it turned to a steady downpour, and soon enough it was hammering down so hard that the wipers could barely keep up. I slowed down to a crawl, trying to follow the faint, twisting line of tarmac ahead. The countryside on both sides was just black silhouettes. Fields, stone walls, maybe the outline of a hill, but I couldn't see much beyond 10 feet. I'd been following signs toward a town called Ballinrobe, but I must have missed a turn somewhere. The GPS had stopped working half an hour before, probably because of the signal, and now I was on a narrow single-lane road that wound through hills and forest. There were no houses, no lights, no other cars. Just rain, darkness, and the sound of the tires pushing through water. When I realized I was on the wrong road, I looked for somewhere to turn around, but the verges were soft and narrow, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck. So I kept going, figuring the road would eventually connect to a larger one. The rain only got worse. It poured down so heavily that the headlights barely cut through it. It felt like driving underwater. Then, without warning, the car sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered once and went black. The engine died completely, leaving only the sound of rain on the roof. I tried the ignition again, nothing. Not even a click. The headlights went out too, leaving me sitting in total darkness, the rain still thundering down around me. For a few seconds I just sat there, hoping it would somehow come back to life. But it didn't. The battery must have shorted from the moisture, or maybe something had flooded. I didn't know much about engines, but I knew sitting there wouldn't fix it. I grabbed my jacket from the back seat and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit instantly. The rain soaked through my jacket within seconds. The wind whipped it across the road in sheets, and I could barely keep my footing on the slick tarmac. There wasn't any shelter, no trees close enough to stand under, and no sign of any buildings or lights ahead. The only thing to do was walk. I locked the car out of habit, though there was no one around to bother it, and started walking down the road, keeping to the edge. Every step splashed into puddles. My socks were soaked through almost immediately, and I could feel the water squelching in my boots. My head was down, trying to keep the rain out of my eyes. After maybe 15 minutes, I couldn't see the car behind me anymore. The road wound through dips and rises, bordered by hedges that looked black and alive in the rain. I tried not to think about how far I was from anywhere, how the road seemed endless. My phone had no signal and the battery was nearly dead. An hour passed like that. I kept walking, shivering harder each minute. The rain didn't let up for a second. My legs felt heavy, my hands numb. My mind started wandering to how stupid it was not to have turned back earlier. I imagined finding an abandoned cottage, some dry place to wait out the storm, but there was nothing. Just the road, the rain, and the darkness. Then I heard something behind me, a faint rumbling sound, muffled by the rain. I turned and squinted through the downpour. For a moment, I thought it was just thunder, but then I saw two faint, flickering lights, headlights, coming slowly up the road behind me. Relief hit so hard I almost laughed. I stepped off to the side, waving an arm weakly, hoping whoever it was would stop. The lights were dim, swaying slightly, but definitely coming closer. The engine noise was strange, though quiet, uneven, like the car was struggling. Still, it was the first sign of life I'd seen all night. As it approached, I could just make out the shape of a small sedan, crawling forward through the storm. The wipers were barely moving, and the beams from the headlights looked weak and yellow, but it was a car. When it drew level with me, I reached for the back door and pulled it open. I jumped inside without hesitation, slamming the door shut to block out the rain. For a second, I sat there catching my breath, water dripping off my jacket. Then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The car was still moving, slowly, steadily, but there was no one in the driver's seat. No one in the passenger seat either. I turned my head, my heart hammering, staring at the empty space in front of me. The wipers squeaked weakly across the windshield, and the wheel turned slightly as the car kept crawling up the road. I felt frozen, too shocked to move. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The engine was barely running, the lights dim, and yet the car was moving, guiding itself along the winding road as if someone invisible was steering it. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but my body wouldn't move. I sat there, staring through the rain-smeared windshield as the road ahead curved toward a faint cluster of lights in the distance. A village. The car rolled quietly forward, the rain drumming on the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. When the first buildings came into view, I grabbed the door handle. The moment we reached the edge of the village, I pushed the door open and stumbled out into the street, nearly slipping on the wet pavement. The car kept going without me, its dim lights fading as it rolled past a row of houses and disappeared around a bend. I didn't look back. I just ran toward the nearest building I could see. A pub, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the dark. I pushed through the door, soaked to the bone, my chest heaving. The warmth and smell of beer hit me all at once. I walked to the counter and sat down, still dripping, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking as I reached for my wallet and fumbled a few coins onto the bar. I didn't even look around the room. I just sat there, staring at the condensation running down my jacket, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I kept seeing that empty driver's seat in my head, the way the wheel had turned on its own. The longer I thought about it, the less sense it made. I told myself maybe it had been coasting downhill, maybe it was some kind of mechanical fluke. But I knew the road had been flat. I must have been sitting there for a few minutes when the door opened again. Cold air rushed in, along with the sound of rain. 2 men stepped inside, both drenched and breathing hard, their clothes plastered to their skin. They looked like they'd been out in the same storm for hours. I didn't pay much attention at first. I just wanted to finish my drink, dry off, and maybe find a phone to call for help. But then one of the men turned, scanning the room, and his eyes landed on me. His face shifted in a way that made my stomach tighten again. He nudged the other man and pointed. I froze. They walked over, their boots dripping on the floor, and stopped a few feet away from where I sat. I didn't say anything. I just looked at them, heart pounding, as they stood there catching their breath. One of them opened his mouth to speak, but before any words came out, I noticed the dirt smeared on their hands, the wet marks on their jackets, and the faint smell of motor oil and rust that clung to them. They'd been pushing a car. My mind clicked the pieces together too late. The dim headlights, the slow movement, the quiet engine. The car I had climbed into hadn't been driving itself. It had been rolling along the road with 2 men pushing it from behind through the rain, guiding it down toward the village. I had just been too soaked, too cold, too desperate to notice. They must have stopped to catch their breath right as I'd climbed in. I could picture it now. Their shock, seeing some stranger open the back door and disappear into the car they were pushing through the dark. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. They didn't look angry, just tired and confused. After a few seconds, they both turned toward the bar, ordered drinks, and didn't look at me again. I sat there, my stomach twisted up, half embarrassed, half shaken. The whole thing had been a misunderstanding, nothing more. But in that moment, sitting in that quiet, rain-soaked pub, it still felt unreal. When I finally left later that night, the rain had stopped. The air was cold and clear, and I could see the wet road stretching out past the last few houses of the village. Somewhere out there, my car was still sitting dead in the dark. I thought about going back for it, but the memory of that empty seat, the way the world had seemed so silent in the rain, made me wait until morning instead. Even now, years later, I can still picture that moment. The sound of the rain, the headlights glowing faintly in the dark, and the eerie, slow movement of that car on the empty road. It was all so ordinary, so explainable once you knew the truth. But for those few minutes, alone in the back seat, with no one in sight and the storm pounding down, it was the most terrifying silence I'd ever known.